Okay. So I wanted to just kind of cover automation scripts. So for those that aren't familiar, this isn't going to be a very good introduction to automation scripts. There's tons of stuff that we've developed over the years, and I'm really going to try to emphasize the newer functionality or some of the things that may not be aware that you have available to you. So this is really going to kind of focus on what we've been adding to the automation script framework over the last couple of years. So first and foremost, serviceability. So one of the things that we've seen as we start to empower more and more people to build these configurations is there's going to be mistakes that are done. A good example of that is opening sets without potentially closing those sets. And I'll talk about some of the other things that we're doing with the warning framework in a future slide. But there are other things that we're doing as well. So one of the system properties that we've added that you can enable will actually go through, and anytime you open a set inside of your automation scripts, if you don't properly close and clean up those sets, what'll happen is we can actually handle that on the framework level. Now, this is not to say that you should depend on this capability, right? Your automation scripts should be doing this automatically on their own. But if you're seeing and you don't know where the problem lies, this is potentially a stopgap solution to try to make sure that you don't have some sort of memory issue in your environment. So this was a new thing that we added. It is disabled by default, but is something you can turn on. The other thing that we added recently was the ability to deactivate all automation scripts. So sometimes what people have done in the past is they'll try to turn on admin mode so they can try to see if an issue is something related to something you've done through a configuration customization kind of scenario, or if it's something that is an out-of-the-box problem. Admin mode is obviously not something you can easily do in a production environment, but also technically can impact some of our out-of-the-box functionality as well. So even if something doesn't happen in admin mode, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's your issue. And there are certain scripts that weren't actually disabled because you were in admin mode. So this new system property, of course, it's disabled by default, but while you're trying to troubleshoot your situation, you can actually enable the system property, and then all automation scripts will become inactive. And then you can turn it back on, and then they will continue to run as expected. So it's a great way for trying to troubleshoot, see if something is related to a configuration change that you've done, or is something that happens out of the box. So these are kind of things that we hear a lot. And so we wanted to kind of build stuff into the framework to kind of handle that. Another concept that we've heard a decent amount is the ability to have additional sources for attachments. So Maximo's supported attachments forever. They've typically been file or URL based. The advantage to file is we have a lot of great functionality inside of Maximo, whether that be doing direct print with attachments for a report, or being able to download them automatically for offline use with mobile products like Maximo Mobile. The problem is there's some functionality that we don't have when you use file-based attachments that you would get in a traditional document management system. So things like revisioning, as an example. Those are critical functions for customers, especially when you have sensitive documents that you want to actually kind of track. So what you can do is you can actually write your own automation script to handle how to interact with that document management system, how to write a new file to it, how to retrieve a file from it, etc. And then as part of that, you can actually use all of that core functionality that we have just as if it was a local file. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You have the capabilities that SharePoint Box provide you, but at the same time, you have all the capabilities that we have in the mobile product or with the direct print with attachments. So this is kind of a neat way to do it. I have a link to just a basic example at the end of the slides, But if this is something you're interested in, obviously the plumbing of how to connect to SharePoint or Box, you'll have to kind of handle, but we've tried to make it easy for you to do. Another recent addition that we've done is bean class events. So for those aren't familiar, the bean classes are really kind of the core Maximo UI framework. So think work order tracking, asset, etc. These don't apply to any of the new role-based applications, work centers, etc. But there's a lot of scenarios that customers have looked for that really need to be done in the bean class. And so what we wanted to do is provide a simple way of interacting with those methods from an automation script. So in the past, there are certain things you could do. So especially like if you had an action launch point, like a push button as an example, you could interact with the UI starting in 7610, where you can actually do things like open a dialog, close a dialog, call other bean methods. But let's say you wanted something like the initialize of that app bean. That's not something you can really do with an MBO event. And there are use cases where you want to be able to provide that hook, or if there's certain actions you want to do before or after invoking the move asset. That's a method that happens in a bean class. And so you can actually do that now. Again, it's disabled by default. You have to enable the system property MXE script, allow bean script. Otherwise, it won't work. And the script just has to be defined in a specific format. So it's always going to be appbean dot the application name. So AKA if your application is asset, you're going to use appbean.asset. And then you also need to make sure, because you're going to define these with specific function names, that you do the allow invoking script functions. So this is a setting that you have to enable on the automation script. And then as part of that, what happens is we'll actually go and call that specific function, such as initialize app, and then that will allow us to execute the code we need. So I'm going to try to demo this in a little bit. I want to cover the material first, and then I'll do all the demos together. Another thing that we added, and this is available in 7613 as well for those that are on 7613, but we really wanted to provide a way for customers to test automation scripts. These are important pieces of your code, and it's not something that you really had a great way to be able to test before. You'd have to go and find a record that matches that criteria, execute the changes, etc. And so now what we have is there's a test script option in the automation script application. And what that test script allows you to do is, based on the data that we know about that automation script, we kind of drive the UI. So if you're testing a REST-based API, as an example, you're going to want to define certain things like query parameters, and you can do that. If you're doing a object launch point, like object save, then you have kind of one or two options. You can either create a new object and kind of set all the values, or you can use an existing record. So if you already have a good record that's a good test case, you can actually tell the path how to find it, whether it be based on a PR number, whether it be based on an ID, etc. You can actually kind of build that out, use that logic against that same object, and then verify the output of what you get. So if you're trying to default values, make sure that those values get set on your record. If you're doing an integration object structure processing, what you potentially may want to do is skip a record, or if you're not skipping a record, maybe you're throwing an error and you want to test to verify that you get the error back. So it'll fluctuate based on the actual launch point or script name, but very helpful to be able to kind of test it. It doesn't save records. So what some people will try to do is they'll say invoke the REST API actually as a test script today, and you make the API request, but at that point you're actually going to be creating those records, and you probably don't want to do that. So by default, our test framework will not actually save any of the records that get changed unless you explicitly call a save. So if you save inside of your automation script, that data is going to be committed, so it's something to be aware of. And also if you have user or setting specific behaviors, so if you want to do something based on the user's default insert site or security groups or person groups, just be aware that your user settings are typically going to be the user that's actually executing the test. So that's something you need to prepare for, and make sure that you do it with the appropriate data points to get the results that you expect. And while this works for a lot of different automation scripts, it's not always going to work for every automation script. So some examples that I kind of listed is, especially when you're doing things that interact with the UI, right? You may be dependent on doing something inside of the work order tracking application where you're launching a dialog or calling a bean class method or something like that. That's obviously not going to work from inside of the automation script application. So that's something that won't work. The other thing is potentially scripts that depend on an owner. So a lot of like the .new scripts, you may want to default some values based on data that you have on that parent record. And there's not a great way to do that. So something to just be aware of if you're trying to test certain scripts. It's not perfect yet. The hope is to continue to enhance it, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Provides you a way to validate after that a patch or change to the script that you still get the desired output. The most recent thing that we added in Manage 8.7 is this concept of a warning framework. So this is really important because, again, we're empowering a bunch of developers to extend Maximo logic. And there's certain things that get put out there that have problems with them that may not be obvious, right? The script may work, it may do what you intend it to do, but there are unintended side effects to the way that you've done them. So what we started to do in 8.7 is we can actually start to analyze your automation script for some of these problems. So this runs as a cron job. By default, it runs every 12 hours, but you can run it as frequently as you want. And it uses a combination of regex and Java. So if we want to validate certain things, we can do really easily with regular expressions. Other things really kind of need a Java class. So especially when we talk about things like leaving open database connections, we need to analyze how many of those we have and how many times we call the free and make sure that those numbers kind of match. So it'll be kind of mix and match. Today, we don't support customers or business partners to be able to add additional rules. That is definitely something we want to do. You're going to have your own settings. Like an example that we don't have out of the box that you may want to warn on is something like a count. So for those that aren't aware, doing an MBO set count adds potentially some overhead because it executes another database query. And depending on what you're doing in that automation script, you may not actually need to do that. You may be able to do something like get size to verify that something exists, or call a not exist, or there's various things that you could do as a potential alternative. So we definitely want customers to be able to kind of add in additional rules. But this is kind of the first release of that, so it's still to be improved. Important thing is these warnings persist until you resolve them. So what that means is these don't prevent the script from running or anything like that. On each of those automation scripts, you can see what the warnings are. Where possible, where we can provide a specific line number, we will. So some things like you're calling print, very easy to give you that line number. Other things like database connections where you're opening them in one line and supposedly trying to free them in another. Those types of things are a little bit trickier, so those aren't going to have line numbers, but where possible, we're going to provide them. And in case that we have like a false positive, this gives you an opportunity to actually acknowledge, A, what we did, that you investigated it, and explain why it's not, so that somebody else is looking at your automation script, they can understand why we feel like we don't need to actually fix what was found in that warning. So I wanted to kind of talk about a couple of the examples and kind of explain why these are things that we have right now, and then we'll get into the actual demo side. So one of the examples is a launch point conflict, and contrary to kind of like what the name implies, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem, but we see a lot of times where customers will have multiple automation scripts tied to the same event. So if you have a work order save event before save, and you have two automation scripts with that same launch point, the order is not going to be controlled. So one script may fire first, and then in the future that could change. So what we wanted to do is present this as a warning. What you can do is you can decide, maybe for this script, order doesn't matter and you just acknowledge it. Or you can look at an alternative. So potentially if the scripts are small enough, you merge them together. If they're larger and you want them to be independent, maybe you have a single script that is on that event, whether it be before save or whatever, and then you use our library script functionality to actually call the other scripts. So that allows you kind of that flexibility to actually control the order and how these operate. Another example is when customers are trying to call saves explicitly in certain launch points. So if you're doing an attribute validate as an example, the expectation is that you're not going to be saving the records. Generally speaking, in Maximo, if somebody types in a value, records don't get saved automatically. We typically depend on the user to save them because that allows them the chance to discard their changes. The other thing that this becomes a problem potentially is if you're opening these sets using MX Server service.getMBO set, one of those challenges of doing something like that is by default, these are always going to open in their own transaction. What that means is if you save and then something else fails, what can happen is you have a partial commit. So whatever you're doing in your automation script potentially is getting committed to the database, even though the other thing that you were expecting to get saved didn't get saved. So generally speaking, we want these to kind of be opened together. So child sets as an example. So that way when something gets committed, everything gets committed or nothing gets committed. So that's kind of a use case of why we want to be cautious of this. There are events such as action-based launch points where a save may be expected. And so we won't throw that warning in that scenario. So it is very specific to certain launch points where we wouldn't expect a save to be called. Another example is using the legacy error key / warn key. So these were implicit variables that we added initially with automation scripts way back when we first implemented them in 7.5. The problem with these are these get evaluated at the end of the script execution. So what that means is if you set the error group and error key way up at the top of your automation script, your expectation might be that the script is going to stop, but in actuality, it's going to continue to process even beyond that error. And then at the very end of the script execution, that's when that error is going to be thrown. So in 7.6, we added the ability to call service.error instead of using the error group and error key variables. And so we want customers to really do that because that's going to be real time and it'll stop the execution of that script. So that can help avoid some issues that you may have if the script continued to process after an error. Another type of warning that we see a lot is object initialized events. So some people aren't aware that object initialize fires a lot, whether you're on the list page. So if you hit enter on the list page and you display 50 work orders, that object initialize event's firing on all 50 of those work orders. Similarly, result sets on start centers. REST APIs. So if you're doing things like Maximo Mobile as an example, and we're using the REST API to potentially download a large set of records, your automation script is going to be firing on those. And there's different reasons why people use object initialize. One is this was the first initialize event that we had. So until 7.6, we didn't really have the ability to do an attribute initialize. And so that's one of the use cases of where people may have used it in the past, is that was how they had to do things like a default. So if you have a new record and you want something to get set, that had to be how you defaulted those new values. So we have new launch points. The attribute initialize is a good one, especially if you have something like a non-persistent that you're trying to set. That'll only fire when that attribute is specifically requested. So in the REST API scenario, if it's in the OSLC select, then it'll fire. Otherwise, it won't. In the case that you're trying to default a value on a new record, the object name.new, so like work order.new, pr.new, etc. That'll make it so that it fires only when the record is being added. And so it's the most efficient launch point for defaulting a value. A lot of times what you would see in the object initialize script is the very first thing someone would write something like if on add. And this allows you to avoid that entirely. You just create the right launch point, and then at that point, your script's going to fire significantly less. Another one that we still see a lot is Mozilla compatibility. So back when we switched from Java 1.7 to 1.8, the Java framework switched from Mozilla Rhino to Nashorn. And what kind of is intended to be kind of a stopgap scenario is to load compatibility. So that way all of your scripts from 1.7, they worked in 1.8 and everybody was fine. The problem is customers have continued to leave this as their kind of solution. And the problem is there's a performance impact to doing this. So we really want customers to actually transition to Nashorn, or if you don't want it to be JavaScript, you can rewrite it in Jython or whatever. But definitely try to avoid doing compatibility. So if you see this type of warning, this is a good one. A lot of times the changes are relatively small. A lot of it has to do with how you handle imports, class declarations, that kind of stuff. So the changes tend to not be very verbose. It really is just making the change and kind of validating. We kind of alluded to this earlier at the beginning, but obviously if you're open sets and don't close them, they're going to be persisted in memory. So we want to provide the use case that you need to clean them up. So if we see where you're opening sets and you fail to close them, we'll track that warning. Another one that's not quite as frequent, it really just kind of depends on the use cases, but you can write direct database queries, and there are use cases where that makes sense. But if you don't free them up after you're done, what'll happen is our framework won't reuse that database connection, and so it'll just be left open. So what we want to do is make sure that in your automation scripts, if you're establishing a database connection, that you're making sure to free up that connection. We don't actually handle this and check it today, but when you do this, you always want to try to do this in like a try except finally in Jython terms, so that you know for a fact that you're actually going to hit it. So where you'd actually release the connection would be in that finally method. But definitely make sure that you're trying to wrap them. So I'm going to get into the demo because we're running short on time. I want to make sure I have enough time to do that. So I'm going to skip some of these other slides. And then, oh, of course, I got logged out. Sorry about that. All right, so one of the first things that I did is using the bean script example. I wanted to filter my assets to a specific location. So in my case, in the automation script, I'll show you it's hard-coded, but this kind of allows us to do this nice, quick, easy filter for the user so that as soon as I get into the asset, I can show things that are relevant to me. And we can make this dynamic. Maybe there's a field on your record that allows you to actually say, hey, I want to filter based on this location or this location hierarchy or some other custom field, especially for customers that have been using Maximo since the V4 days, where we didn't really have the capability to have sites. A lot of customers depended on location hierarchies to kind of act as a filter, or a custom field to act as a filter of the different locations. And so what you can do is you can actually execute that set QB just like we have in work orders where we're filtering for history flag, your default insert site, etc. You can add your own filters that get applied automatically. It's a good use case of the initialize app being example. So I'm gonna go in here and show my app being.asset. And again, it's just a really simple automation script, but there are definitely use cases like this where you'd want to use it. And again, if I had other methods that I wanted to intercept, like let's say we had the move asset, I think it's something like this, then I could actually do my logic here and then intercept that method essentially. So there's a lot of good use cases for being able to do being classes. And then I kind of wanted to talk about the testing a little bit. So let's just use an object structure import. So in this case, one of the things this is designed to test is somebody provides an invalid item on a spare part. So by default, we throw an error, but we don't actually tell you what's wrong. So this script is all about identifying which spare parts are invalid, displaying it to the user so they know that they can fix that import. So I'm going to hit this test script. And because this is an object structure processing, I can either do XML or I can do JSON. So I'm going to choose JSON. I'm going to browse my files and I'm going to do test import 1. So this import is going to fail. So this one is has some bad data for that item. And I can see that my exception's thrown as expected, and I can see what the bad item is. If I then go and I pick an item that does exist, and I should not get an error, I can test that and see what the data would be. So if I have any types of overrides, if I want to see what all of our default values are, etc., I can see the actual data of this record as if it had been committed into Maximo. So it's a great way to kind of be able to test the processing of those inbound automation scripts and verify that you're getting the results that you expect. Another one that I wanted to do is print PDF. So this one's a REST API based automation script. And essentially what its intent is it just returns the first PDF file attached to a doc link and renders it as an actual PDF. So like one of the things that we added recently was the ability to actually obey this content type. Before, the REST API automation scripts would always return data as JSON. But this is a use case of where we want to actually be able to return the data as a PDF so the web browser knows how to render it. And so this is something we added, and we also backported that to 7612 and 7613. But let me go and test this. So in this case, because there's no launch point on a REST-based automation script, you kind of have to pick what you're trying to test. So I'm going to say that it's a REST API. I'm going to test with the GET. Because it's a REST API, the assumption is that we're going to have some parameters. So I'm going to type in the parameters. So in my automation script, I'm specifically looking for work order number. And then I'm really specifically looking for site ID. And when I hit test script, it's going to look like a bunch of junk. But this is actually the PDF contents. So I can actually verify that, yes, it actually returned back the PDF that I expected. And then if I type in something that doesn't exist, I can actually see, oh, I'm throwing the error that I have invalid parameters. So because this work order doesn't exist, I can't actually find it. So therefore, I'm throwing this error. I apparently forgot to configure that message in this environment, but you can kind of see how that works. All right, and I got 2 more minutes. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the warnings really quick. So the first one is going to be a really simple one. And that is, I established a database connection. So I wanted to get what the next value should be from the sequence. And so to do that, I have to establish this database connection based on my user's connection key. But the problem is, at no point do I actually free this connection back up. So when I go to my warnings, I'll actually see that our database connection needs to get released, and we didn't do that. Now, if this was somehow a false positive, I could actually acknowledge it, type in some notes, etc. EMX print PDF. So the example that we were just testing before, this one is one where I'm opening a set. So right here, I'm calling service.getMBO set on work order, but I forgot to clean it up. So this is a really good example of where I built an automation script. I'm opening the set and I completely forgot to clean it up. So on the warnings, I can actually go and see that, hey, I need to have a matching MBO set cleanup to release those resources. This is actually a real example of where I screwed up. So even people with a lot of experience can easily miss it on occasion. The other one that I wanted to show you just to kind of highlight, the scenario is not as important. So this particular automation script is one we shipped out of the box, but it actually uses some print statements. But the important thing here is because those prints, we can actually define exactly line by line. You can actually see each of the warnings and you can see exactly where the line is. So we recommend using an alternative and why, and I can see every single line where this occurred. So it's a good example of being able to actually associate those lines. And then I think we now want to leave the rest of the time open for questions. So I am ready for questions. Let me try to open the question chat. All right. Okay, so what level of Maximo do these bean level class events become available? So there are some things you can do in the UI, and starting in 7610, where you can interact with the different bean class methods, but the system property and being able to directly hook into those bean class events is something that does require MAS. It requires manage 8.7 specifically, so MAS 8.11, manage 8.7. I'm not seeing the reference system property in 7613. I think that was related to the bean class, so that would explain that. Is there a place we can go to review these details, like a detailed patch notes or blog? Great question. So in my notes, I do have additional resources. We have a wiki that not everybody is familiar with. This wiki is our intended place of documentation for all these. So for the different types of events, like there are things I didn't cover like roles, we actually provide the examples here in documentation about how to use them. If there are things that you don't see that are missing, happily we can try to build them out, just let us know. We want to try to make this as comprehensive as possible, and so we're trying to use examples and use real life scenarios as much as possible. Can you does appbean.mbo work for databean as well, or only appbean? I'm not entirely sure the question on that one, but essentially, if you're interacting with MBO events, you want to use our traditional launch points. Only when you want to interact with specific appbean methods would you use the appbean process. Now that obviously once you have the appbean, we do have the ability to interact with MBOs, but it's really when you want to tie to those events directly. Explain the order of script execution. I assume that means you wanted to understand that multiple launch point scenario. I don't want to say it's random because it's not entirely random, but generally speaking, the way the script execution works, it depends on our launch point event, if that's what you're talking about, where you want to know if the out-of-the-box code fires first or our code fires first. Generally speaking, our code typically fires second, but it does vary based on the events. But if you have multiple automation scripts on the same event, we'll go with the order as random, even though it's not entirely random. Presentation recording, yes, we'll definitely make sure you have that. And then can you give an example of defining an MBO for testing the JSON file? So I don't have enough time because we were about to wrap up, but definitely we can make sure that we get some more documentation on the automation script wiki for test and kind of walk through how you can test different scenarios. And I think that is it. All right, Joe, I think I'm going to
Perfect.
hand it
Thank
back to
you
you.
so much, Stephen. Yeah, all the materials will be posted in the More community at the conclusion of the event, and we'll be sure to send out emails to you all with all the links that you will need. And Stephen, any of these other questions can also be answered in his breakout room on Thursday at 3:40 p.m.